It so happens that as a result of many thousands of years of experience and a lot of knowledge, humanity has understood that materialistic joys have always been at odds with the movement towards God. To be honest, overconsumption, drunkenness, filthy fleshly pleasures, and even swearing and acquisitiveness from time immemorial have been the causes of illness, death, and full-scale military conflicts. So, people have realized that the only way to save themselves from all these either sins or certain risks is in isolation. But it was possible to serve and to pray in this very isolation, a monastery, for example, from an early youth. For instance, no inheritance for the youngest son? Go to the monastery. Did the daughter sin before her wedding? Monastery is the way. Or it's just that one didn't get married. So also to the monastery. Was she the wife, mistress of the ruler and turned out to be infertile? Especially to a monastery. There are so many pretexts. But what was going on in the monasteries themselves would make your hair stand on end. So if you'll continue watching, be prepared. This is Flip Side of History, and today we'll tell you about nuns and what was going on behind the closed doors. Let us continue. Features of life in monasteries that will surprise you. From ancient Greek, monk means lonely. That being the very principle of the monastery is the custom of solitude of a person so that no one of others distracts him. It is no coincidence that each of the inhabitants has its own separate room, cell, and it's fully empty. The cell is in fact associated with emptiness. A medieval monastery and a nunnery too resembled a kind of fortress with strong walls and could withstand an assault or siege in case of necessary. There are many reasons for this, but the main one is the significant monastic wealth, which was used by a lot of people. At the same moment, it was much easier to keep the nuns within the framework of the common rules. In general, the idea was that nuns should live exclusively on the territory of their communities, minimizing contact with the lay people. Communication with men was especially strictly forbidden. It's easy to know why, but nonetheless, it was often the other way around. There was another restriction adopted specifically for convents. Nuns had to sleep in separate beds. This peculiar moment was introduced due to the fact that in the Middle Ages it was believed that a woman was more addicted to carnal pleasures than a man. What did nuns do? The edicts usually prescribed a very difficult and outright uncomfortable life for the nuns. It was believed that having accepted monasticism, they renounced worldly temptations and carnal pleasures, and thus should live accordingly, without comforts and pleasures. Each single day, the nun had to attend several, usually about 6, services, the earliest of which could begin at 2 or 3 a.m., and the last one would end around 8 p.m. On church holidays, services took longer. In addition, it was imperative to devote oneself to prayers and godly connection in private. Often there were only 4 to 5 hours a day for sleep. It's pretty understandable that the nun's clothes were supposed to completely deprive her of attractiveness from perspective of femininity. This is temptation. Ordinary clothing was a spacious long robe, cassock, and necessarily a kerchief, cap or other headdress that completely hid the hair. Cosmetics and jewelry were excluded. The rules of some monasteries required clothing to be made of coarse fabric. And yes, the nun's hair was cut as part of the ritual of becoming, well, a nun. The food had to be of the simplest sort, it was prepared on the spot, and it was taken by everyone together in the common dining room. Many fasts were required and meat was, as an unwritten rule, considered an undesirable product. Most of the rooms were not scorched. It was believed that all the nuns were in essence sisters, that is, fully equal to each other. In reality, though, there were many women from noble families among them. They brought a considerable dowry with them to the convent, and because of it, were usually relieved of majority of heavy work assigned to the sisters from simpler families. Sad to admit, but education was also not very common among nuns. It was more often men who were engaged in writing and creating books, and if it was done by women, then usually it was really privileged nuns. Among this minor category, there were indeed very educated people. Forbidden things within monastery walls. Even in our days, not much is known about the practice of monastic life. Anything could happen outside the monastery fence. The most frequent forbidden practices were rituals that resembled pagan ones, such as joint feasts of monks and nuns. drinking, dancing, and games with sexual connotation. There was a period when people even turned a blind eye to this. But despite a long period of not paying attention to this, in the 12th century the rules were tightened. But still rites like the ancient Saturnalia stand firm. Let's say in France, where this reigned until the 17th century. In some monasteries, abbesses and senior nuns practiced outright exploitation of juniors in truly sadistic punishments. Young novices were forced to do all the work in the convent, while they themselves rested or indulged in sexual deviations. There are known cases, thank God they were not truly popular, but still when abbesses forced nuns to sell their bodies to someone. At Littlemore Monastery in Oxfordshire, this was reportedly practiced on a regular basis from its foundation in 1245 until the exposure of a particularly enterprising abbess in 1517. We know that you already are well aware of what kinds of punishments existed in Middle Ages. And no, convents and monasteries were not an exception. Offenders in monasteries were put in shackles, kept in cages where it was impossible to stand up to their full height, even walled up in walls or buried while still breathing. Yes, medieval justice system allowed for such punishments, but the fact is that it was done quietly, without a trial, and it was an ordinary thing to use the convent as a women's prison. Hidden from public eye's life of nuns. Women and even young girls were in a lot of cases sent to the monastery completely against their will. Women who were considered useless or without a dowry were exiled here. Parents could simply dedicate their daughter and pretty much decide for her that she should be devoted to the church lifestyle as a kind of donation. It is fully expected that such girls did not at all strive to observe celibacy and strict rules and tried to constantly cause problems. But we must repeat, the conversion of a monastery into a fully operating house of carnal pleasures, as at Littlemore, was still rare. But Boccaccio or Franco Sacchetti, who tell stories about the love affairs of nuns in their novels, are not misinterpreted information or myths. This was commonplace, and most often the nuns' partners were male priests and monks. Shockingly for many, but there are many references in written sources about the connections of nuns with priests, and with laymen as well. Apart from that, there are also depictive paintings on these subject matters. It is very clear that such behavior was not welcomed by the church itself or truly spiritual members. The sinning nuns were justifiably afraid of reprisals. In the Middle Ages, there were ways to prevent pregnancy, but if a child was born, plain massacre was common. The anti-clerical Leo Taxil mentions a number of infant skeletons found in the masonry of a swimming pool in an Italian convent. There is a miniature depicting a nun throwing an infant into a restroom. Some examples. Obviously, dissolute nuns could not always hope for assistance in hiding their sins. The situation could develop in different ways. For example, Cesarius of Arelat mentions a nun who became pregnant. The woman died of complications of pregnancy and was punished after her death. The members of church refused to bury her in appropriate manner. A 12th century chronicle mentions another case. As a punishment, the nun was locked alone in a room where she gave birth without help. The child died 2 days later. After that incident, the woman was forgiven and returned to the monastery. In 1318, Joanna Leeds fled the convent after faking her own death. A paper requiring her to return indicates that Joanna indulged, first of all, in carnal activities while free. But the next case is absolutely of outrageous nature to say the least. Catherine Wells, the last abbess of Littlemore, sold off the convent property, cohabited with a priest, and even had a daughter by him. Littlemore was shut down in 1525, with all its nuns of easy virtue receiving forgiveness and discharge, and Wells herself receiving an annual pittance for life. Other lesser-known cases. First, some women decided to get rid of attraction by disfiguring the body with a whip. Second, those nuns who sinned were buried upside down. Most of them were in their 30s. A child was often buried with them. Third, the nobility was much less likely to bestow dowry on convents with women, considering them plainly unnatural. Fourth, very often in the case of a neighborly location of a men's monastery with a female one, their inhabitants dug an underground tunnel in which monks and nuns met. As a consequence, there were children. Fifth, very often in European kingdoms, convents were so poorly maintained and hungry that nuns paid for the supply of food and the repair of the premises with their bodies. Sixth, the reason why about a third of all women who ended up in a convent was pre-wedding fornication, in other words, losing virginity prior to wedding day. Seventh, another 25% got into it against their will. Former important husbands, kings, tsars, or noblemen got rid of official and even unofficial halves in this way. They knew way too much, so they had to be locked up in convent. Eighth, to add all these percentages up, 3/4 of the nuns could constantly think about escaping, and many of them did. And ninth, in the Middle Ages, the idea was imposed on a woman that she should not have any fantasies of her own about carnal pleasures. Her whole existence was only to please a man and continue his lineage. To say the least, in the Middle Ages in Europe and its many hundreds of years, men simply exploited women. That was Flip Side of History. Thank you for watching our episode. If you found out something new today and enjoyed the episode, then leave a like and subscribe. And for now, we'll see you in upcoming episodes.